We're going to continue our discussion of CSS Grid. Welcome back. And in the previous video, we looked at CSS Grid. You know, we did a basic example with Grid, and then we looked at applying Grid to the Zen Garden page. So this was my Zen Garden page. I thought about this, and I you know, just as a side, here, I thought, what would look great maybe is, what if I made the name here larger, right? And then this could be smaller on the next row, right? So let's give that a try just for fun. So, what I want to do here is target this first element, right? So I know that I have, two child tags or child nodes within this LI. So this is our selector for the LI, and we can say, let's get all the children, right? Actually, like this, right? Any child, right? All of them, and then just do a colon first child, right? So could be any tag, but it has to be the first one. Okay. So why don't we do that, and then do font size of 2M. Oh, great. And then this first tag is larger, right? Maybe let's do font weight of 100. I kind of like that, but maybe it's a little too light. I don't know. Maybe what it needs is, it needs a little vertical space. So let's try that, right? So how about this now? What we want to do is I got a challenge for you, right? What if we wanted to add a little bit of margin, between each of these things, right? So I want a little bit of margin, right? How do I add margin to each of these three elements? Let's try it. Well, actually, we can use the same arrangement here, but instead of applying to first child, we can just say like all the children, right? any type of tag, right? As long as it's a child of this LI, that's a child of that UL that is inside of the, or is a descendant of design selection. So let's say margin, and then I'm going to use the shorthand for margin. So the first number is the top and bottom, second number is the left and right. So let's set margin on the top and bottom to 1 rem. Okay, so that looks pretty good, but I kind of feel like I got too much space at the top here and too much space at the bottom. Like I want the same distance here as at the top and the bottom, right? And now I have a little extra, right? So let's change this, right? So if this is top, right, bottom, and left, let's set the bottom to 1 rem, okay? So now this is even here, but I have too much space at the bottom because there's margin here and margin here. Actually, it looks like this by actually is not going to pick up the margin. Actually, maybe that's okay. Actually, I think that looks all right. Anyway, but we can tinker with it. But how do we get rid of the margin at the bottom? Okay, give that a try. So there's a challenge for you. You can stop the video and give that a try. Okay, so did you figure that out? Let's give it a try here. So same situation that we used up here, but we can switch it to last child. So I'm going to change this to last, and our last child is going to have margin bottom of 0. Okay, so that's looking pretty good, right? Actually, that looks very nice, right? Look at a little picture in here. Okay, anyway, let's move on with Grid. Okay, so we're going to take another look at Grid. Now, Grid has a lot of properties, and there's a lot of different ways you can use it. And I have an exercise for you. There's another game. I found another web game for Grid, but those are fun. So, and they're kind of different, right? So you'll do that later. But for right now, let's look at the other Grid property that I think is like the most powerful one. So if you're going to learn anything, just get Grid template columns and grid gap down, and then learn grid areas. Okay. So I'm going to scroll down to this section, creating complex grids, in our lesson for today, right? And what I'm going to do is, you could use this markup right here, right? I'm going to take this, and remember that example that we made earlier, this example here. I'm just going to replace the these elements right here with what I had here, right? And these use the same class name of box, but then instead of the ABC, it has header, sidebar, main, and footer. So what I think I'm going to do is I'm going to change the names here to header, side, main, and footer, right? So I'm going to do side, main, and footer. Okay, so these will be the 4 sections that we use. Okay, and then otherwise we don't even need this, right? And then this will just give it some padding so we have a little more vertical space, right? Because we don't really have too much content here. Okay, and then yeah, and then we got our container. So I'm going to open this up in my browser here again so we can see it. So currently it looks like this because that's where we left off before with 6 grid columns. Okay, so I'm going to delete that. And what we're going to do here is we're going to create a container, right? So, or actually, I guess we've already created a container. We're going to create a rule for container, and we kind of have that already, and we've set it to display grid. But what we're going to do is I'm going to copy this and paste it here so we can take a look at it. Let me format this a little bit, right? Okay. And what we're going to do is we're going to define the grid template columns. So here I have 4 columns, right? And then I set the gap to 1em, and then I define grid template areas. Now, if you look at this, you can see I have these strings, right, each quoted, and then there's kind of a line return, and then there's a semicolon here. So what's happening here is this is defining an area that spans 4 cells, or 4 columns, I should say. So this is one cell that's 1 row tall and 4 columns wide, okay? The syntax for this is that you need to make each row a string, and you have to quote it, okay, when you want to break it to the next row. And then the whole rule ends with a semicolon, so you can't put a semicolon at the end of each line. You can see the syntax breaks, right? So the semicolon ends the whole thing. So here I've defined grid template areas, and then here, you know, is the area, right? And you can put this anywhere. Like I could move this up onto the line here, and you could kind of write it in any way. Let me move this over like this, right? So it could be, you know, here if I wanted, you know, or you could put it on the next line down below, right? What's great though is if you arrange it in your code editor so it's easy to read, then, you know, because this kind of reads like 1 row, and then you can see this is 3 columns wide and 2 rows tall, right? And this is 1 row and 4 columns, right? And this is 1 column and 2 rows, right? Let's take a look at this, right? So here you can see a larger image of what I've created over here. This is where the header is going to go, so I use the name H. You can put any character here, but we put a space between them to separate them, right? And these need to be contiguous, right? So we can't have a gap here, right? You can put a dot if you want to create an empty space. I know this is kind of a lot to take in. We'll come back to it, but like you can put a dot in there for an empty space, right? But essentially I want to map the header to this, the main area into these, the sidebar into the 2 S's, and the footer onto the F, okay? So the goal here is to kind of create this kind of arrangement. So I'm going to put one of my boxes here. That'll be like, you know, header, right? And then the sidebar right here, the orange one, will be the sidebar, okay? So how do we do that? Well, if we look at the page so far, you can see, like, you know, it isn't really doing it. I did get the 4 columns and I did get the grid gap, but I'm not really mapping these as I've described it, okay? So in order for that to work, we need to do one more step. We need to target the element and then map it to a grid area, okay? So to do that, you're going to say grid area, and then you're going to use the identifier for that area. So H would be this top row, Okay, now you could copy and paste this, but I've already got the class names for header, side, main, and footer, so I'll just use the ones that are existing here, and I'll say you are going to go to grid area H, okay? And then sidebar is going to go to grid area S, and main is going to go to grid area M, and footer is going to go to grid area F, right? Notice how I use the name, right? So footer F, you know, grid area is F, right? So that, you know, if you do that, it makes it a lot easier on yourself, right? And then single letters makes it easy to lay this out and read it here, right? So, so anyway, let's take a look, right? So there's our layout, right? Now, I didn't set the row height, right? So the rows are going to be as tall as the content, right? And that's usually what we want to do, okay? So anyway, so there we go. Let's imagine we want to, now there's an imaginary 4 columns here, right? So this is 1 column, this is 3 columns wide, right? If I wanted to add an empty space here, like maybe this footer, you know, doesn't want to go all the way across, you could put a dot in there, right? And then it'll give you a blank area, okay? I would have a problem here if I put the dot here, right? Because, you know, like I can't break this line. I can do this though. I could put G, I could put G there, right? And that would be okay. So this would go for 2 columns. There's a blank column. And then if I had something mapped to grid area G, it would end up here, right? Let's give it a try just for fun. So let's say I make a new div here. Now again, if I'm going to map something to this grid, it has to be inside of the parent element that is, you know, display grid, right? So if I put this outside the grid, it's not going to be able to be mapped to the grid here, right? So let's do a div there, and then give this a class name of box, and call this like, maybe I put my social media links in there, right? Let's give this a class of social, also I can spell it correctly. There we go, right? So I'll give that class a social, and then now we'll need to map that element to area G, right? So, you know, I see social here. Actually, it's kind of mapping it there by accident, but it's actually putting it in a dot. Well, let's fix that, right? So what we're going to do is we're going to say social. You are going to have a background color of, let's find another color here. How about, dark sea green. That's a pretty good color, right? So there we go. That's kind of weird, like without assigning it to the grid, it kind of just finds the next open space and puts it in. You know, I guess that's the default behavior. Okay, and now let's map you to a grid area. So I'm going to say your grid area is area G. Okay, and then it gets over here, right? So so this grid area thing is like super powerful, right? Because and there's too many great ideas that you can do with this, right? One of the things that is super powerful about this is responsive web design, right? So if you have a responsive design, you can create a media query, and you can just change the grid areas, the grid template area inside that media query. So you can just redefine this property in the media query, and then everybody will map to the new grid squares, right? So that's super powerful. Maybe I'll do an example of that later, okay? But for right now, this will be the video on grid area, okay? And I'll stop here. My challenge to you now is to take this idea, right? And now, after we've done all of this work with our, you know, our text, we put images in there, we styled the fonts, you know, and the colors. Now it's time to do the layout, okay? So my challenge to you is to think about the big picture here and how you want to lay out the elements of the Zen Garden page, and use CSS grid areas to do it, okay? So I'll see you in the next video, and maybe I'll do an example just on the CSS Zen Garden page for grid areas, okay? And again, thanks for watching, and have a nice day.